Good afternoon and welcome. My name is John Mon. I'm the manager of the research program here at the Green Growth Knowledge Platform. I'm very keen to open for you today's webinar, which is entitled Using Trade to Drive Green Growth, New Tools and Perspectives. The timing really couldn't be better. Trade and environment are at the center of what we as members of the global community aim to achieve in the next 10 odd years. I'm speaking, of course, of the Sustainable Development Goals. Here is an interesting diagram that perhaps some of you are already familiar with, but I think it puts all of this into perspective. You see down at the bottom is the environment, representing the biophysical assets that provide the basis for our economies and our society. And trade is all the way up on top in Goal 17. Somehow either the culmination of everything below it, or perhaps the hub of the wheel, helping to keep all of these unruly parts together. Probably it's a little of both. The name of this particular goal is partnerships. And it includes global cooperation around trade as well as finance, technology, governance, and other matters of cooperation. So as a global partnership ourselves, the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, the GGKP, is glad again to host today's webinar. We were launched over 4 years ago by the Global Green Growth Institute, the OECD, UN Environment, and the World Bank. And the GGKP now represents the world's largest community of organizations and experts committed to collaborating in the sharing and generation of green growth knowledge and data. We also meet another important partnership here today, UN Environment and the World Trade Organization. We'll be presenting a new forthcoming report on making trade work for the environment, as well as prosperity and resilience. Finally, we'll see 2 tools presented today that help us not only better understand, but also apply our understanding of how trade and environment can be mutually supportive. A database on environmental clauses and trade agreements, as well as a sustainability toolkit for trade negotiators. Just incidentally, for any more information you'd like to have around green growth, knowledge, tools, data, case studies, take a look at our website, ggkp.org, where we've got all of this and more, as well as a working group, so a research group around green growth, trade, and competitiveness. I want to mention 2 more things before we get into some logistics. First, I'd like to take the opportunity to quickly introduce to you our new Green Growth Expert Connect service, which provides policymakers in country direct and free of charge access to some of the world's leading technical and policy experts around green growth across a variety of themes, including trade, but also others. I'd also like to mention that coming up very quickly is the GGKP's 6th annual conference, which is taking place at the OECD in Paris from the 27th to the 29th of November this year. And that's happening in conjunction with the OECD's 2018 Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum. The theme this year is inclusive solutions for the green transition, including competitiveness, jobs or skills, and of course the social dimensions of development. And that's including trade and environment. For more information on either the Expert Connect service or the annual conference, again, take a look at our website. Now, before we get started, I just want to mention a few logistics for all of our listeners today. First of all, I strongly encourage all of you to raise any questions you want throughout the webinar, starting now. This can be done by typing a question into the chat box, which you can see on the upper right-hand side of the webinar dashboard on your screen. And once you do submit a question, that will be submitted to our technical staff here at GGKP, and they will then repost them to all webinar participants. And the panelists will be able to then address them in the Q&A. Also, after the webinar, we'll be circulating a 5-minute survey, literally 5 minutes. We kindly request that you take the time to complete it. The reason we ask this is not to give you one more task, but because it helps us improve our future webinars, and we hope you'll join us there too. Finally, if you have any technical issues, feel free to contact us. The email address is contact@ggkp.org. and we'll help you troubleshoot through them. Finally, let me note that all the presentations you see here today, as well as a recording of the webinar itself, will be available on the GGKP website very shortly after the webinar, in case you missed anything. So finally, let me end, before I turn it over to our good moderator, where I began, which is hopefully going to give you a little food for thought, and that's this SDGs wedding cake from Stockholm Resilience Center. When I look at the figure, environment at the base, trade at the top, goal 17 on trade seems one of two things. It's either very powerful, sitting at the top of a pyramid overlooking everything, or it seems very lonely and fragile. Somehow, to me, it seems a fittingly ominous impression of where global partnerships are today, and perhaps multilateral trade, most importantly of all. I'll leave the rest of that discussion to the experts. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce to you our moderator today, Natalie Bernasconi Osterwalder. She is Group Director of Economic Law and Policy at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which many of you may know better as IISD. Natalie is a senior international lawyer working with developing country governments directly in relation to bilateral and regional investment treaty negotiations, as well as investor state contracts, model investment treaties, and foreign investment laws. But don't let all of that fool you. She's also an expert on trade. Natalie, I'm very delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, and it's a great pleasure to turn the podium over to you.
Thank you very much, John. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this GGKP webinar series. And today we will discuss using trade to drive green growth, new tools and perspectives. Now, the trade and environment relationship has had a rocky past. In the late years of the GATT and the early years of the WTO, governments and civil society have wrestled with the tensions arising between free trade disciplines and environmental regulation, between free trade rules and multilateral environmental agreements. So over the years, governments have included new provisions and approaches in their trade agreements, attempting to address some of these concerns. And in recent years, in addition to rules aiming at addressing tensions between trade and environment, governments have also explored ways to support and incentivize green growth. And this will be the main focus of today's webinar. Presenters will share, as we heard from John, share and discuss new models, tools, data resources available on the trade-environment linkage. In particular, we will look at environment-related provisions included in trade and investment agreements. We will see how these tools can help policymakers better assess how environmental challenges and opportunities can be addressed through international economic law to supplement their national laws and policies. We will also have the pleasure of getting a snapshot of the upcoming joint report that will be released by UN Environment and the World Trade Organization on making trade work for the environment, prosperity, and resilience. And now we will have the privilege of having 5 speakers at our webinar today. The first 2 speakers will be Stephen Stone and Ike Ho Lim. Stephen Stone is Chief of the Resources and Markets Branch at the Economy Division at the UN Environment. And prior to joining UN Environment, Stephen worked at the Inter-American Development Bank, serving in a number of capacities, from resource economist in Washington to environmental specialist in the bank's offices in Jamaica and Ecuador. And he was also representative in Honduras. The second speaker will be Aiko Lim. He is the director of the Trade and Environment Division at the WTO and is in charge of the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade and its committee. Ho has held a number of other roles at the WTO, including counselor in the cabinet of the two WTO Director Generals and advisor to the Director General's consultative group on the future of the WTO. He also served as a senior economic affairs officer at the G15 and urban habitat specialist at the ILO, the International Labour Organization. We will then move on to the next two speakers, the first being Jean-Frédéric Morin, who is an associate professor at the Political Science Department of Laval University, holding the Canada Research Chair in International Political Economy. And Jean-Frédéric Morin is also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation and the Earth System Governance Project, and he is a member of the McGill University Center for Intellectual Property Policy. Clara Brandy is a senior researcher and project leader at the German Development Institute, and her main research interests include global governance, international trade policy and trade agreements, and interlinkages between trade, sustainable development, and climate change. And then finally, we will hear from Ying Zhang, who is the Program Management Officer of the Environment and Trade Unit of UN Environment. She focuses on environment-related issues in trade and investment agreements, trade and climate change, as well as South-South cooperation on green trade and global value chains. Ying has also been the Deputy Division Director in the Ministry of Commerce of China and was posted as a diplomat to the Chinese Embassy in Denmark. So without much further ado, I will pass the mic and the screen to Stephen and Ho, who will tell us a little bit about their upcoming report and their findings.
Okay, Ho, are you on?
I am just on, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Natalie. And Ho and I are actually here together at the WTO, and we plan to actually speak together and make the presentation together. Perhaps that's symbolic of the partnership that we've created between UN Environment and the World Trade Organization. So with that, Ho, I would hand it over to you. As we agreed, you would be the first speaker, but just to sort of follow on from Natalie, and then we'll try to use our time as constructively as possible.
Right. Well, thanks very much, Stephen, and thanks very much, Natalie. It's a pleasure to join this webinar, completely new experience for me. So I'm likely to make many mistakes with clicking through buttons and screens as we go through, but let's try this first one, which is to share the screen. I don't know if I've successfully done that or not.
Brilliant.
Can you see anything?
Yeah,
you can.
Good.
But I can't see anything. But anyway, I think I will see something shortly. You know, as already been mentioned by Natalie and also by Stephen, you know, we've embarked on what we found to be a really important set of dialogues that have started with my Director General, Roberto Azevedo, together with Eric Solheim. And they had a series of chats from last year leading up to Davos and at Davos itself to basically say that we need to do more to ensure that trade works for the environment, for prosperity and resilience. And at the same time, we also heard from Executive Director Eric Solheim to say that, you know, the environment community, at least as he saw it, should also view trade as a very positive tool to build resilience, prosperity, and environmental sustainability. So the challenge in front of us is not a new challenge, of course, is to see how do we actually go forward, you know. And to do that, we have done a couple of things this year. One, which is to work together on a joint publication for which these slides are based upon. This publication will be released at the time of the WTO Public Forum on 2nd October this year. And at that time, we will also be having a joint event on making trade work for environment, prosperity, and resilience. And we would invite all of you that can make it, to come join us for the public forum, to join us for the launch, and to join us for the event. Let me stop here and pass the floor on to Stephen as well. I'm sure he would like to say a few words.
Thanks very much, Ho. And perhaps we could advance to the next slide, which has a wonderful picture of Eric Solheim and Roberto Acevedo meeting in Davos earlier this year. I think we just go down.
I don't seem to have control of the screen. Hang on. I see what I have to do. Just a minute. Sorry about this.
And really, it is a relationship that has been building well. I would say there's a great chemistry at the top, which certainly helps. And there's also a commitment, I think, which is shared across the UN and the Bretton Woods organizations, that 2015 created something special. The Sustainable Development Goals created something special that truly is universal, and it truly is shared. And it does require an effort that goes across the UN, but not just across the UN. It goes across all the countries which signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, the private sector, the motor, which makes our economies work. I think one of the key features for me is trade now accounts for like 1/3 of global GDP. It's just a colossal volume of goods and services and resources that are traded. So we have to look at it if we're talking about a sustainable future. So maybe with that closes it for me, Ho, in terms of introductory remarks. Maybe then we could jump into the presentation.
Yeah, as Stephen said, we've organized these slides so that we will each take different segments of it. Steve will start with a few of these slides, and then I'll jump back in.
Okay, wonderful. So I think I have 3 slides, and I hate text on slides, but unfortunately, bear with me, there is some text on the slides, and the picture is a little jarring. But frankly, in some ways, the scenario is a little jarring. We were all sort of aware of the extreme weather events that have been cropping up and the damages from the extreme weather events. And then other parts are not so visible yet, such as scarcity in clean air, scarcity in clean water, other sort of basic ecosystem services. To the point where now the World Economic Forum, our friends in Davos, consistently are mentioning environmental risk, climate change as one of their top 5 risks. I think that's one of the key messages. And then, of course, the other key message here is that we're an expansive world. I mean, global GDP is what? It's around 80 trillion, more or less, probably a bit more. I haven't checked it for a year or two. And we are consuming massive amounts of resources, and we're moving them around the world. And that's normal because we have expanding incomes and we have expanding middle classes around the world. The question is, are we fit for purpose? Are our economies fit for purpose? And are our trading systems fit for purpose? So maybe that jump to the next slide. We like to see things from an upside at UN Environment, and I think that helps us also to reach out in a way that's constructive. So some of you may be familiar with our Green Economy report from 2011. And the basic premise was, well, what if you took 2% of global GDP, which is not a huge amount, if it's 80 trillion, we're talking about maybe 4 trillion to 2 to 4 trillion a year, and shifted that into green investments. And the results were really interesting because with a fairly marginal level of investment, you can actually generate large benefits, not only for the environment, which is important, but also for jobs, income, and basically growth, which is what we want, sustainable growth that doesn't destroy our resource base. There's another way of looking at this as well, and that is our metabolism. The Resource Panel, International Resource Panel, estimates that we use about 90 gigatons of raw materials every year, of resources. That's a fairly huge amount, and it's more or less growing at the same time that the economy grows. $80 trillion year economy, 90 gigatons of resources a year. The question is how to make it more circular, more resource efficient and less wasteful. And the interesting thing is some of the modeling done by the panel shows that there are actually major gains, like trillions of dollars of gains, by becoming more resource efficient and more circular. So I think I have one more slide, which sort of ends my pitch, which is basically, you know, when we step back, which we all do, I think these extreme events kind of jar us from time to time, and we say, okay, we've got a challenging situation. We've got fairly robust institutions. We've got major challenges. How do we retool? And that's a bit of at the root of this partnership, I would say. How do we actually embrace the opportunities that are within trade to create growth, to create jobs, to create income, and make that a driving force for sustainability in a world which is increasingly interconnected and which both innovation and technology are accelerating. So those are some of the features that we see that are outlined in the report. And here, Ho, I would hand it back to you to maybe dive a little deeper on this thought and perhaps other aspects related to trade.
No, thanks very much, Stephen. I think that sets it up quite nicely for the rest of the presentation. Now, I think one of the challenges, you know, I think many of the things that have already been said, very few people would disagree, and very few people would find it odd that we are thinking about how to make trade work better for the environment. The challenge comes into being more specific, to sort of saying, what exactly can we expect from the WTO or from trade relations in general? And here I think it's useful to zoom in a little bit, looking at what's happening in trade, and in a particular segment, let's call it environmental goods. It's a sector that's sometimes very ill-defined. There's no fixed definition as such as to what we mean by environmental goods. But if we can understand that there is a group of goods, and let's call it services as well, that perform a variety of functions that can be essential to tackling environmental problems. And this can be in terms of production, can be in terms of consumption, can be in terms of transport, can be in terms of goods and services that you need to deal with pollution, remediation, etc. We start to see that here trade can play quite a big role. Let's start with just, say, exports of environmental goods. This is a very basic trend, a trend line to say that it's been going up over the last decade. And if we dig a bit deeper, you know, we find that international trade actually is playing already quite a significant role in diffusing environmental goods and services, to actually reducing costs, ensuring that, you know, that there is a supply of technology going to different markets where they might be needed the most, and actually reducing costs. You know, one of the big stories behind environmental goods is, of course, goods in renewable energy, such as solar panels, and you find a dramatic reduction in costs. I can't claim that all of this is due to trade, but I would say quite a big chunk of it is due to trading patterns and enlarging markets, economies of scale, and greater competitivity in some areas, helping to reduce costs. And, you know, today something like 70,000 solar panels are being installed virtually every hour, and this trend is going to continue. But if we take another look at this in terms of the trade relationship, we also find that there are really interesting things to see in terms of trade policy. Take one type of measure that most people are familiar with, which is a tariff. Okay, tariffs generally are quite low on industrial goods. And a wind turbine is an industrial good. If you look at wind turbines, you find that tariffs are actually a little bit higher than the average tariffs today. And what's interesting about this is that a wind turbine isn't one single product. A wind turbine is made up of many, many components. Actually, there's something like 8,000 components to a wind turbine. Here on this slide, you just get a few of them, from gearboxes, tower parts, roller bearings, transmission shafts. And we've just given you a few numbers. It's a simple WTO MFN tariff rate, 6.3% to 9.6%. Doesn't seem that high, but it is very high, because if you consider the fact that many of these parts actually move in and out of markets all the time as part of a value chain. They multiply, essentially. And of this example that I have of a wind turbine, some 50% of the components are going to be imported and exported as the wind turbine comes together. And with 8,000 parts, with multiple transactions taking place, that 5.8% can easily shoot up to being something like 100%. And it's reducing these sorts of costs very concretely. You can see that there's opportunities here for trade to play a bigger role. Another sort of quick example before I switch back to Stephen, just talking about value chains. I just mentioned it earlier on wind turbines. This is a graph of another type of product, lithium-ion batteries that are needed in electric vehicles. It's quite a complex value chain. These products are crisscrossing the world in many different, towards many different markets and in many different stages of production. Again, one of the big stories have been falling prices in electric vehicles. Some of the reasons for why electric vehicles have fallen in price have to do with the fact that batteries have fallen in price. And again, why do batteries reduce in price? It's partly, again, economies of scale, and it relates again back to trade. At the same time, there remains tariffs on batteries. If these can be further reduced, and each of these component parts, similar to the wind turbine example that I gave, you can find another sort of tool, if you like, by which trade can again contribute to, well, lowering costs, improving productivity, and in this sense, help push certain technologies that are greener into the market. So these are just some examples. And I'm not sure, am I meant to cover this as well?
You can if you want.
I can if I want.
Yeah.
But would you like to jump in, Stephen? Or you leave it to me, it's fine as well.
Why don't you take this one and I'll take the next?
All right, okay. Maybe just before I take this one, there's one thing I didn't mention. So far, I focused very much on goods. We shouldn't forget services. Services are also a very important part of the environmental sector. In fact, environmental services make up some 65% of the cost of a solar panel purchase. So as we improve conditions for goods trade, we also need to think about conditions for services trade. And sometimes tackling services trade is more complex than goods because barriers in services trade are typically not so transparent. They're not in the form of a tariff at the border. They're more in terms of non-tariff measures. And so I try to understand the services trade economy, its contribution to the environment. I think is another very interesting area for us to think more about. This particular chart, I think, is very familiar to the panel, particularly Jean-Frédéric, who has done a lot of research in this area. So I won't say so much apart from to say that, you know, when we think about how do these elements of different trade policies create an enabling environment, a lot of it is captured through trade agreements. One important type of trade agreement are regional trade agreements. And last 30 years, we've seen a proliferation of these agreements. And we've also seen that they contain, in some cases, very specific environmental provisions. But I'm sure, as Jean-Frédéric will tell us, it's very hard to say exactly what type of provision in which agreement, because there are many different models out there. But I think the main point is that we do see a trend that talks about the increasing recognition of trade policy being used as a tool to support sustainable development. And, you know, of course, one can debate about how effective these tools are, which agreements work better. You know, are these particular provisions doing more than just setting a sort of principle, sort of benchmark? You know, what actually is the substance of the RTAs? Again, a very important area for research, and Jean-Frédéric has already done quite a lot of this. Let me pass back to Stephen then.
Okay, thanks very much, Ho. Yeah, and I'm told that Jean-Frédéric will speak more on the issue as well, so there's some nice tie-in to what we're presenting here from our joint report. I mean, this slide should not be a surprise to many people, although it's interesting to see the density of legislation and norms that are developing around the environment. And it isn't a coincidence. I mean, I think we're seeing, as the environment becomes more scarce, we're seeing a demand for environmental services and environmental qualities, such that climate laws, environmental laws are now actually coming into force, both internationally through the Paris Agreement, through the Sustainable Development Goals, but at the national level as well. And, you know, the thing that struck me as I was looking at this slide and sort of seeing the larger picture is, it's good, it's about time, because the costs of pollution for UN Environment, we did a major focus on pollution last year, and we're talking about $4 to $7 trillion a year of damages to human health, to productivity, to cleanup, to remediation, just simply really large, both in absolute and percentage terms of GDP, impacts on our environment, on our well-being. So this is another thing which, in effect, is a driver for green trade or sustainable trade, because as preferences shift, as knowledge increases, I think we'll see a greater willingness to pay for the markets and the services and the products that can be traded, that can help clean up our environment and improve our quality of life. There's a next slide here, and I think actually, it's me really again. Back over to you.
Okay. Now, what is this slide? Well, this slide basically shows you notifications to the WTO. WTO receives notifications from all of its members, the 164 members, for every trade policy, trade regulation, trade measure that they adopt. And it's sort of governed by different agreements. And what we have in the WTO is a database. It's not so well known, unfortunately, but it's a publicly available database. It's the Environment Database. And we have been tracking since 1997 quite painstakingly each and every measure that is notified to the WTO, and to look behind the measure what type of environmental objectives are contained in these measures. And it's a big task because every year we receive close to about 10,000 notifications. The other thing that we do is that we look in the content of trade policy reviews and actually study the trade policies of members to extract from there the environment-related content. Why do we do this? You know, why this sort of big effort? Part of it is to better understand how are trade measures being used to pursue environmental objectives, and also the other side, to see how environmental objectives can sometimes emerge in trade measures, and whether these are, you know, if you like, sort of measures that are fully transparent to the trade community. It's something that developing countries were very interested in knowing. And over time, what we found is that the trend keeps going up, as you would expect. You see more and more environment-related notifications. A large number of these notifications fall under a very particular agreement in the WTO called the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, which basically covers measures related to technical regulations, standards, labeling, certification. So we can see that's where members are adopting more and more measures serving an environmental goal. The other thing that I draw from this sort of chart, which is I think quite very interesting, is that Natalie said at the beginning the rocky relationship between trade rules and environmental rules or environmental provisions. But if we look concretely at the data, you find that actually that friction is actually a very small part of what's being notified to the WTO. All of these measures that I'm talking about that have been notified to the WTO have not been the subject of any trade dispute, nor any complaint in the committee. The actual trade disputes that have arisen and been very important disputes are actually about, I don't have the exact figure, but I think those that went to the final panel and where you actually did get the panel decision comes down to something below 10. So there might actually be a lot more things going out there that people don't notice, which is that the WTO system is already adapting quite a lot to environment-related notifications contained in trade measures. So that was one of the things that I thought would be interesting to highlight. Maybe you should start, since I've been talking, even though it's like put with me at the top.
Okay. No, it's good. And I'm aware that Natalie may tell us at any moment that we're reaching our time limit. So yes. I'll be fairly quick. I just think in terms of this partnership going forward, UN Environment has a lot that it wants to offer. A lot of it is through our Environment and Trade Hub, which is led by Anja van Mokte. She's actually on the line, works with Ying, who's one of our panelists today. And they do a lot with building capacity, with environmentally sound technologies, increasing coherence between environment and trade governance, and really looking at the upside for green markets as well, because we know they're growing, and we know as preferences shift, there are huge markets there, and entrepreneurs know this as well. The business community knows this quite well. So that's where we're focusing. And
okay, very quickly, a couple of things have not yet been mentioned. The Committee on Trade and Environment, another one of my responsibilities here is to look after work happening there. And that's the committee where the WTO members come together and they try to better improve both their own knowledge, but also to increase transparency on how trade and environmental measures are being undertaken. And under all of this is under the objective of sustainable development, which is already enshrined in the WTO under the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement. More specifically, sometimes that means rules looking for more stability, more predictability, dealing with situations where there may not be such coherence or there might be inconsistencies. And this happens also under the committee. Attempts to negotiate very particular agreements to enhance the trade benefits to an environmental goal. The most well-known at the moment, I would say, would be elimination of fishery subsidies. Another part of this work is about supply-side capacity. Many developing countries require technical assistance to improve their supply capacity to trade. And as part of this, we have different programs like Standards Trade and Development Facility, Aid for Trade, Enhanced Integrated Framework that focuses on supply capacity. And increasingly, we're seeing that quite a lot of the supply capacity is also about sustainable trade. So different elements here. Yeah.
Good. Natalie, if you'll bear with us, we have 2 more slides, 3 maximum. And we've talked about what we're sharing here, the cross-cutting actions, I would say, that go across UN Environment, WTO, and beyond, UNCTAD, IISD, the many partners who are working in the trade environment space. And really, it's about multilateral cooperation because there are transboundary issues here. It's about trying to spark the virtuous circles between economics and the environment, and that's happening as well especially through the emphasis on circular economy, which is really interesting. And at the upcoming WTO forum, there's a specific event on circular economy led by Finland and Costa Rica. And then, of course, it's about going for those win-win opportunities as well, where you see countries like Costa Rica, Finland, France, and others who are really trying to spur the market forward in terms of increasing the innovation and technology that they're picking up that's beneficial for the environment and good for their own people. Ho, I'll let you take the second slide with the other 3 areas.
Yeah, I think a lot has already been said, and I think that the slide speaks for itself. And it's basically, we're trying to spearhead more of these actions. The only thing I would say is that sometimes these actions require not just cooperation between institutions like WTO, UN Environment. It requires, all of you, the civil society. It requires governments, a very important part of this. It requires businesses. So I think we have to look at this in terms of, as it says, cross-cutting actions involving a very wide group of people. Not all of these things are going to be achievable in the WTO, I'll be quite frank. But at the same time, we do think it's important that we talk about this and that we find the right avenues to pursue some of these actions. So that's my conclusion on that, and thank you all very much. We have one other slide, I'm told, which is on the SDGs, of course, SDG 17 in particular, which does have a mandate for global partnerships. There's also the SDG that we often refer to with the trade linkage. And our publication is a modest effort to try to find some common avenues for a way forward. We will have a very good debate at the public forum in our high-level event on making trade work for environment, prosperity, and resilience. Director Eric Solheim will be there, so will my Director General. We will have a very good panel. So please look at the WTO website, look at the UN Environment website. That's my advert, Natalie, sorry about this. And please, join us virtually if you can. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Natalie.
So welcome back, everyone. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I've had quite a few questions come in, and some of them you've already addressed, maybe anticipating some of the questions. So one of the questions, and I'll just mention it now, and you can think about it while we move to the other speakers. One question was, do you see any roadblocks ingrained in WTO's economic law system that discourage stricter regulatory regimes at the domestic level to protect environment compared to what we have today? And so this is a little bit along the lines what Ho had anticipated, and speaking about some of the actions taken for the environment, and that didn't lead to actual disputes, but may still have been found to be a problem. And one of the reasons I think that I mentioned this specific question is because, of course, if we want to address the issue of climate change, we'll probably have to have really disruptive environmental policies. And for example, you mentioned the benefits of trade rules to encourage the flow of environmental goods. And we're thinking here about solar panels, car batteries for electric vehicles, and so forth. And so the question that is in line with the previous question would be, do you think it is sufficient to promote trade in these areas, or do you think governments will have to be more interventionist and perhaps require the phase out of traditional cars, accelerate in that way the move to electric cars, or may it even be necessary to ban certain categories of fuel-intensive vehicles in order to achieve our climate targets? So these are some of the questions that have come up, and we'll come back to these in the discussion, but because we're running a little late, I would like to move on to our next speakers who will share with us their resource, their database on environmental provisions in trade agreements. So I would like to give the floor now to Clara Brandy from German Development Institute and Jean-Frédéric Morin from Laval University. Thank you very much in advance, and thank you again to the previous speakers. I look forward to a discussion.
In trade agreements and on the empirical evidence for sound policies in this area. As many of you will know, the number of bilateral and regional trade agreements has skyrocketed, especially since the 1990s, as you can see in this slide. These preferential trade agreements, these PTAs, go far beyond the traditional reduction of tariffs. By now, they include a broader array of policy areas than ever, including the environment. Since the turn of the millennium in particular, more and more of these PTAs have included a growing number of environmental clauses. And by now, each agreement includes on average around 60 different types of environmental clauses. So people make opposing claims on trade agreements and the environment. For example, some people present TPP as an environmental disaster, while others called it an environmental gold standard, including Obama. So public debates are full of diverse opinions, but so far there has been little empirical evidence, and hence there's a need for TREND, the Trade and Environment Database. Negotiators, for example, need examples of the types of clauses adopted by other countries. NGOs need reliable information to hold governments accountable. Lawyers need to contrast the wording of similar provisions to guide their interpretation. The private sector is interested in an accessible data set to navigate through the overlapping agreements that exist. And researchers need fine-grained data to investigate the drivers and the effects of environmental provisions in trade agreements. To address all these needs and to establish TREND, the Trade and Environment Database, Jean-Frédéric Morin and his collaborators used human coding to check at least twice the full text of around 630 trade agreements since 1945, tracking more than 300 different environmental clauses. These 300 different environmental clauses can be grouped into 10 different categories, and you can see them on this slide. Some of them reaffirm environmental law principles like the precautionary principle. Some ensure a high level of environmental protection. Others favor transparency and public participation in policymaking. They safeguard regulatory space for environmental policymaking, and they can promote environmental cooperation. Some provisions address specific environmental commitments, be it the use of renewable energy or fossil fuel subsidies, or the protection of fish stocks. Some can help to ensure policy coherence, while others promote development and capacity building, reinforce existing MEAs like the Paris Agreement, and address dispute resolution. TREND, this Trade and Environment Database, is freely available on the website of the University of Laval. And you can check it out there, as you can see in the slide. But to make sure that this data is not only accessible to researchers in an Excel file like this, but to a broader public, including policymakers, civil society, the private sector, and the media, Jean-Frédéric Morin teamed up with us from the German Development Institute to conduct research and also to visualize the fine-grained data provided by TREND. So we developed and launched the interactive online tool Trend Analytics, which you can see on the slide. You are free to check it out online, and you're welcome to get in touch with us if you have any questions. The interactive world map that you can see on the current slide provides the big picture. The bigger the country bubble you see, the higher the total number of environmental clauses a country has signed to in all its PTAs. The greener a country bubble, the more environmental clauses it has signed to per trade agreement. So Trend Analytics offers this bird's eye perspective on the uptake of environmental clauses in trade agreements over time. But it can also offer various ways of zooming into the great diversity of environmental clauses. For example, at the country level, at the agreement level, and also at the very detailed level of individual provisions, individual environmental clauses in trade agreements. You can also search for an array of different environmental issue areas, such as biodiversity and climate change, in all of these 630 trade agreements that have been coded. I'm now handing over to Jean-Frédéric to say more about some of the research results that have come out of research conducted on the basis of TREND.
Thank you, Clara. So based on this data set, we conducted several different studies, and I'll present you a quick snapshot of a few of our key findings. First, we realized that the mid-1990s was a period of intense innovation. So several environmental provisions that we commonly find in several trade agreements were first introduced in the 1990s, and especially in NAFTA and its side agreement on the environment. Those were groundbreaking agreements, and they introduced several of the environmental provisions that have been replicated widely elsewhere. So because NAFTA and its side agreement were really innovative, countries like the United States, Canada, and Mexico rank in the top 5 of the most innovative countries measured by the number of unprecedented environmental provision introduced in their trade agreements. But they are not the only one. The EU is also a very innovative entity. Several EU agreements are quite innovative, especially the different Lomé's agreements were quite interesting from an environmental point of view. But most of the recent agreement actually include very little innovative provision. Take the case of CETA, so the agreement between the EU and Canada, or the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now called the CPTPP. Those are among the greenest trade agreements ever concluded, measured by the number of environmental provision in them. But most of these environmental provision are basically copy-pasted from earlier agreement. The only innovation in CETA is actually a provision on water, and the only innovation in TPP concerns subsidies for fisheries. That said, being innovative, I don't think it is the most important thing. I think what matters perhaps even more is replicating good ideas that and innovate an interesting provision from other agreement. And this slide here shows that there is still plenty of opportunity to copy good ideas from other countries. So each of those lines here represent a different type of environmental provision. When the line here is 100% blue, it means that this provision can only be found in EU agreements, in European agreements. When it's entirely red, it means that this provision in the entire set of trade agreements can only be found in agreements signed and concluded by the US. When it's gray, it means non-EU, non-US. So you can see there's quite difference. There's a significant difference between the EU and the US. They have a quite different model. That being said, there's also quite a lot of gray here, and I think it's important to keep in mind that there are very interesting and innovative environmental provision in non-EU, non-US trade agreements. I have in mind the Peruvian agreements, or even Chinese agreements, agreements from New Zealand. But I don't think negotiators often look at these agreements when they are looking for inspiration for their agreement. Instead, what we see is a transatlantic convergence, actually. So American agreements are becoming more similar to the EU agreements, and EU agreements are being increasingly similar to the US agreements. So what you have here is a heat map. You have all the US agreements on the vertical scale, on the vertical axis, and you have the EU agreements ranked, displayed in chronological order on the horizontal axis. And when you have a little square that is red, it means that this particular EU agreement is similar to this particular, is highly similar to this particular US agreement. And since they are displayed in chronological order, what you can see is that EU agreements over time are becoming more and more similar to US agreement, similarity being measured by the by sharing similar environmental provision. So an example of this convergence is environmental exception included in trade agreement. So what you have here, each little dot is a different trade agreement. When it's a red dot, it's a US agreement. When it's a blue dot, it's a EU agreement. And you can see the number of environmental exceptions included in these agreements. So you can see that the US, and especially NAFTA, which is the first red dot with 11 different exceptions, environmental exceptions, that the US was a pioneer in including several exceptions for the environment. But the EU is catching up. That said, the learning process is not going in only one direction. It's going in the two different directions. The US is also borrowing something from the EU. And you have an example here. Again, the blue dots are EU agreements. The red dots are US agreements. And here what you have is, for each agreement, is the number of different environmental issue areas that are being covered by the trade agreement. So by issue area, I mean water, deforestation, air quality, birds, GMO, fisheries, ecotourism, endangered species, and so on. Typically, EU agreement will include will cover several different issue areas. And not the US, but the US will address the environment in general. Until recently, where the US increasingly will follow the EU model, if you want, and will address specific environmental issue areas in their trade agreement. But despite this convergence, there are still significant differences, especially in the type of issue areas that are being addressed. So the US will include several provisions related to deforestation and biodiversity. So the US ranked pretty high in terms of the number of biodiversity related provision per agreement. The US does not rank particularly high in the number of climate-related provision per trade agreement. The EU, on the other hand, is quite a leader in the introduction of climate-related provision in trade agreement. As you can see from this slide here, in 1995, basically every single trade agreement mentioning climate change or having provision that are directly relevant and related to climate change, all those agreements were EU agreements. So in these networks here, each dot is an entity, a negotiating party or a country, and each line connecting two dots are a different trade agreement, including climate provision. So in 1995, few agreements and basically all connected to the EU. In 2015, wider network, much more diverse, less centered around the EU. Actually, an increasing number of countries, especially in Asia, will include climate-related provision in their trade agreement. That being said, not all of those provisions are significant. Some are quite modest, especially on climate, I have to say. But it's not that there's no interesting provision. Some provision are really, including on climate, are very interesting. It's just that some of them have not been replicated and reproduced many times. On this graph here, every line is a different environmental provision, and you can see from the left on the left hand side of the graph, some of them, I mean, they're the blockbuster of trade negotiation, if you want. I mean, they've been replicated hundreds of times. They're very well known, but you have many different type of environmental provision that you can find in only 5, 4, even only one trade agreement. So if you're looking for inspiration, where to look, I would say first look at the trade agreements negotiated by democracies, because we have found that there's a significant correlation here between the degree of democracy and the tendency to include environmental provision in trade agreements, even if you control for various other variables. And I would say also look at some key developing countries. Some of them have very innovative and interesting provision. If you take, for example, the case of genetic resources and traditional knowledge, it's not the EU or the US that are leading on this issue area. It's countries like Peru and Colombia. And this is what you see in this graph. Peru, Colombia will include several provision that are related to genetic resources, frequently in their trade agreement, and quite a diverse also set of provision related to genetic resources. So does all this, this is all well and nice, but does it matter? Does it change anything? Well, we have some evidence that in some cases, but those are more the exception than the rule, but in some cases, PTAs have favored sometimes ratification, but especially the better implementation of some multilateral and multilateral agreements. I can come back to this in the Q&A session, but there's a connection between implementation of MEAs and the inclusion of environmental provision in trade agreements. We also collected data on the environmental laws adopted domestically. And in some cases, it doesn't work for all countries, it doesn't work all the time, but in some cases, we were able to find a correlation between the inclusion of environmental provision in trade agreements with the adoption of new environmental provision in certain countries, in certain circumstances, and on certain issue areas. But I'll be happy to come back to that later. Other studies have found also correlation with an improvement in the overall state of the environment. So there's a number of different studies, more to come, and thank you very much.
Thank you for this very interesting overview of the developments in trade agreements. And one of the things when I was looking through all the questions coming in that relates to probably both presentations and that we could look at when we have a discussion after the next presentation would be about regionalism versus multilateralism, because there was one question that came in where the listener asked, what are you doing, and this was still with respect to the previous presentation, what are you doing to stop increasing bilateralism and get again room for multilateralism? And of course, what's interesting here is that what you explained here is really related to what's happening at the regional, at the bilateral level with respect to the environment. And so what does that mean? Are we stalled at the WTO? Are we still moving ahead on environmental issues at the WTO? And what does this rapid development in the regional and bilateral at that level, what does it mean for multilateralism? I think several listeners are preoccupied with that. So we can come back to that question later on. And hopefully we can also have a concrete example of what you think is one of the most effective provisions that you encountered, because you said in your presentation that, for example, on climate change, there are there's a very big number of new provisions, of innovative provisions, but only few of them are actually actually implementable and effective in their design. So it would be interesting for us and everyone, the audience, to hear what kind of provisions you've encountered that are probably the most effective in their environmental objective. But before we move on to the discussion, we'll have one more presentation from Ying Zhang, who will also present a tool that IISD has been quite actively involved in preparing with UN Environment. Unfortunately, Ying, I have to ask you to be very short, because we do want some time to discuss with all the panelists. And luckily, the tool that we jointly developed is available online. So many of the things that you may want to share now can be explored after this discussion online. So I'm sorry, Ying, but I have to ask you to be quite short. And then you can continue in the discussion, of course.
Hello, hi. Thank you, Natalie. Well noted. I also want to say that since a few participants already asked the time for Q&A, so I'll just wrap up a few points. First of all, thanks to for hosting very interesting and timely discussion on what I'm going to discuss and share with you today is basically what we do on trade and trade growth at the Environment and Trade Hub of United Nations Environment Program, and also to discuss with you a tool that we developed together with colleagues from RSC to support trade negotiators in using this to bring environment and trade together to deliver green growth and sustainable development. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Environment and Trade Hub, I just want to say a few words of who we are. So the hub was launched in 2015 and with 4 objectives listed here. As you can see, the 4 objectives, including using trade as a tool to support environmental sustainability and improve policy coherence, help countries harness their trade opportunities, and also to realize a shift to more sustainable patterns. I won't spend much time on this. I think trade and green growth have been covered well by the previous speakers. Two key points I'd like to highlight again is really there are huge opportunities presented by green growth and green economy. At the same time, the trade policy and trade measures itself serve as an effective tool to deliver green growth and support countries' transition to a green economy. But how can we do this? There are different ways of doing this, but most importantly, we think is to bring environment into the trade debate and into trade policy. Our new publication, joint publication with WTO, will provide more detailed analysis of this different ways, especially how multilateral trade system has been supporting the discussion on environment and trade. But I would just spend more time on the regional trade agreement, where you have already seen from the previous presentations that there's a growing number of regional trade agreements, and also the agreements that include environmental provisions. I think these 2 charts here also echo this trend. And so far, in fact, 60% of the recent regional trade agreements that contain environmental provisions go beyond WTO commitments. So there are opportunities in terms of their scope, breadth, and index, and how they can best support environment into trade policy. But why we exactly need a sustainability toolkit for trade negotiations? 3 things came to our mind when we first came with this idea. The first one is to improve knowledge and understanding. I will just give you one example about this. Last year, we organized a workshop in Mongolia on trade agreements and environment. At that time, Mongolia has only one regional trade agreement. That one does
Ying,
not.
I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry, Ying. I have to intervene.
Yeah.
We can't hear you very well.
Oh,
in fact,
sorry.
you're cut off in your sentences, so we cannot understand what you're saying very well. We have, of course, the PowerPoint, which helps, but maybe you can try to continue, but I'll stay online for now, and I may have to to interrupt if we cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry for that. I did the test session, but I'm not sure what's the problem. Is it better now?
Better, yes.
Okay, yeah. So I'm just continue with the workshop we organized last year in Mongolia. At that time, Mongolia just has one free trade agreement, and that one does not include an environmental chapter. So the discussion there triggered huge interest from the participants, from governments, from civil society, and from private sector. A few participants asked, so for countries like Mongolia, whose 80% of its exports is directly related to mining and natural resources, how can we ensure that connecting to global market will not exert extra pressure on Mongolia's environment, which is of great importance to the country economically, socially, and culturally. So there are knowledge gaps, and that's why we are trying to fill those gaps with this toolkit. And the second thing is to support negotiation and implementation. This is also of particular importance for negotiators from developing countries who normally do not have a very big supporting team with lawyers, with economists, with professors or economic modelers. So what we want to do is to provide a Swiss knife or a toolkit that with all the tools that can be used by the negotiators to help them solve the problems and find solutions. And finally, by using the toolkit, we also hope that we can help to bring environment and trade communities together in finding solutions and in solving problems, because they belong to different policy domains. And from time to time, we realize that environmental community and trade community do not speak the same language. So that's why we want to bring them on board together to open the discussion with private sector, with civil society, and to think about innovative ways on how can we best work together to bring environment into trade policy. Next, I'm just going to quickly take you through of this toolkit. So if you can see now, this is a website of the toolkit. And on your left-hand side, you can see the table of contents, which can serve as a navigation tool to show you different sections we're looking at in this toolkit. So we start with the question, why is sustainable development important to agreement? And then we continue with housing environment with the agreement. What are the possible solutions? What are the possible ways to do this? We need a side agreement, or an independent chapter, or an annex. You can find answers here in this section. And the next three sections include more detailed examples and analysis of environment-related provisions in different parts of the agreement. Here, I just want to take one example of environmental cooperation provisions. If you click into here, you can see after the analysis of the background and the rationale, you can see different options. And with each option, we have added examples from 90 agreements. So here you can see, here is the example. If you want to go directly to the original text, you can click the button here, which will direct you directly to the original text. We also add a small comment bar here, where to explain how commonly this kind of option has been used. Is it commonly used, or is it just a new approach that have been only used in select recent agreements? And finally, we also have a small section on questions related to process. So how can we best conduct environmental impact assessments? How can we organize public participation and multi-stakeholder consultation? And also questions related to review, reporting, and evaluation, which is growing importance to this agreement. Here in the suggested readings part, we have included a few extra resources, including the trend database that has been presented earlier. But we are also working with colleagues from the ISB to update the toolkit in order to include more resources and examples. We would be particularly interested in working with you in 4 areas, including targeted training and advisory services based on the country's demand, and also sharing of experience and good practices, especially for some of the new topics. We think that peer learning would be really helpful. And also for feedback and evaluation, for instance, to what extent are these provisions effective? How can we make them more effective? And finally, it's also partnerships and innovation. As I just explained, we need to bring different stakeholders into the discussion. And by bringing different perspectives, we believe that we would be able to find more innovative approaches, not just through the text of the agreement, but also the ways that we can work together and communicate with each other in the environment and trade in a more mutually supportive manner. And finally, with that, I think I can conclude my presentation. But once again, if you are interested in the toolkit and environment trade, please join us on 2nd of October for the environment and trade dialogue at WTO. It's the first dialogue of its kind, and a lot of interesting topics will be included, such as circular economy, trade and climate change, and blue economy. And for those of you who will not be able to join us in Geneva, you can also follow us on Twitter and social media, where we will be live streaming the discussions there. So thanks again for your attention, and look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, Ying, for this presentation. I'm sorry about the problems with acoustics, but I think we understood the basics and the most important parts of this toolkit, which complements the previous database that we discussed. And so I think we can now move on to a discussion. And I would like to invite everyone onto the screen so everybody can see you. And I've already asked a few discussions. I'd like to just come back to the database and the toolkit first, very briefly, but very briefly. What do you think in these tools, in these provisions that you examined, what was the provision that you thought, oh, this can really make a difference? So if I could ask Jean-Frédéric just a quick answer, what you think really could make a big difference, what you found in these trade agreements.
Yes. Well, first, there are important safeguards to make sure that certain trade commitment do not hurt the environment or do not restrict the ability of lawmakers to adopt legislation domestically. So I'm thinking, for example, about investment protection. So there are very important safeguards to be put in place to make sure that investment protection commitment do not restrict the ability of lawmakers to adopt environmental legislation. Then I think some people will argue that there are interesting provisions related to dispute settlement. Environmental agreements are not known for their strong enforcement mechanism, but trade agreements are. So if you cover the environmental provision under the umbrella of the trade dispute settlement mechanism of the PTA, that could actually bring a stronger enforcement mechanism for commitment that are already in place. Other people will argue that capacity building is something that is very important and is likely to induce change over time, technology transfer as well. And I think from my interesting area to look at in the future would be probably trade in green goods and services. So far, and perhaps surprisingly, we don't see a lot on this front in PTAs. But it would seem as a win-win situation, good for trade and good for the environment. But we don't see a lot of diversity and a lot of interesting provision on this so far.
Okay.
Same for fossil fuel. We don't see a lot of interesting, but I think this is coming in future years.
Okay, so you couldn't pick one, single one, or maybe you did have you did have 1, 2, 3. So the first one is really a do no harm, and I think that brings us back to the old debate. We don't want trade rules to restrict environment, and that I guess is something that has been also addressed in some of the regional trade agreements. And in the WTO dispute settlement decisions, we can see some of that as well. So I won't go, we don't have the time to discuss this, although it's a very interesting topic. Out of these 4 or 5, no, you said fossil fuels are actually, unfortunately, not properly addressed in any of the agreements that you looked at so far, or not well enough is what you mentioned. So that would be an area where we could definitely do more. But out of these 4, you also said do no harm, enforcement, capacity building, trade in goods and services. Just in one word, Clara and Ying, for you, out of these 4, what would you rank first?
Well, I guess do no harm is the basic bottom line, right? But then the surprising thing is that trade agreements actually go beyond this, and we also find that environmental provisions in certain issue areas like air and water are linked to domestic regulation in these countries adopting these provisions.
Okay,
so we actually
very good.
Some positive results in certain issue areas, and that's very promising.
Okay, and that will bring me to the question right away to Steve and Ho, but just Ying, but one word, which one? 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, for me, I would say is the part for evaluation and monitoring. So that we have good how can we really
okay, we're losing you. We heard evaluation and monitoring. So it's more the enforcement side, very important that maybe trade can actually do something, or trade instruments could do something to help enforce some of the environmental commitments. And that brings me to a question that was mentioned, that came up when I went through the many questions, and I found that very interesting. One question was, has the quoted report, so the UN WTO report on environmental damages of economic activities, analyzed the specific contribution of trade through maritime and air transport? So the impacts of maritime and trade transports, were these addressed in this report? This is one question. And then a related question, which made me think this is very interesting. What are the most important areas to tackle to ensure transportation and packaging in international trade are made sustainable? So very interesting question. So the first one is very, very easy to answer. Do you address this in the joint report, the issue of damages caused through maritime and air transport? Second, what do you think about including maybe transportation and packaging issue in a trade agreement, actually? Could you have a consensus of governments to tackle this issue and come to on a common ground? So Steve and Ho, maybe Ho, you want to begin?
Sure. Yeah, on the first question on transport, we do mention and we do deal with the impact of trade on the environment, but we don't have a big research chapter on this as such. You know? What the reason why is that this report, as I was saying, is admittedly a more modest sort of contribution. It's not a research report as such. It's a report that's trying to understand what are the spectrum of issues. If you wanted to get a more detailed look on transport and trade, there is another report that again was a collaboration with UN Environment and WTO. It was called Trade and Climate Change. That was back in 2009 though, so it's quite some time since. And there was a more detailed treatment looking at the transportation effects on environment, emissions in particular. And there it reviewed the literature at that time. And the conclusion at that time was that the effects were ambiguous. There were effects that were positive from trade in general. It is not transport, but from trade had efficiency effects. On the other hand, there were negative effects, such as the ones mentioned on transport. And the final conclusion was on the review of the data was somewhat ambiguous as to which one was stronger.
Right.
Time for new research.
Okay, well, we have a research agenda coming up. Very good. About the maybe you would like to focus, Steve, on the transportation and packaging idea. So this viewer or listener asks whether this would be something to tackle at the international level.
Yeah, very interesting questions, both of them. I mean, the main thing, just going back to maritime and air for a moment, is that those are off balance sheet for the Paris Agreement, which is a huge lacuna. I mean, it's a huge missing element of the carbon budget, the world's carbon budget. So it's like the 10th largest source of emissions. And we know it's large, but it's not attributable right now. So people are working on that. But particularly for air, it's one of my pet peeves that is totally underpriced and probably very misleading in terms of footprint. On the transportation and packaging, you know, it reminded me of the question that you opened with, Natalie, which was, you know, is it sufficient to promote trade policies, or do you need a stronger government presence? And I was thinking about plastics. I was thinking about all the recent government decisions around plastics. Two come to mind immediately. One was in January, when China said, no more, we're not taking in more plastics. Recycled plastics from the EU, and that was a real, let's say, a thought provoker, you know, sort of a policy provoker for the European Union, because suddenly they have a lot of plastics that they have to deal with. So a real push for the circular economy. And I think, frankly, you know, those kind of national decisions are going to play out more and more in the multilateral space, because the world is simply more interconnected. So I think we're going to see these nudges and these prods from big economies that are going to be looking more at their own sort of narrow interest, but then trying to sort of shape the governance, the multilateral governance, to suit them. And my personal view is that's going to put a lot of stress on the multilateral institutions, because it's hard to reconcile sometimes.
Well, that is a very nice closing word. I would love to invite everyone to say another sentence of what would be on their wish list if they could put something into the international agenda on environment and trade. But I'm afraid I can't do that, and I can't also, unfortunately, ask you all the questions that ran in front of me on the screen. And I hope we can catch up perhaps offline, and then do another event for all these listeners whom I thank very much that they joined us. So thank you again to everyone. Thank you, GGKP, for hosting this session, and I hope you all had fun, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Very strange experience.
Yeah, that's too bad that it was.
We didn't